All right, the fact to follow Marcus, we're going to change tack a little bit. We're going to be talking about data visualization techniques. This talk I've done a few days ago at the Power BI bootcamp. Did anyone by any chance attend that Power BI bootcamp a few days ago? Great, this is all going to be new to you. That's exactly what I wanted. A little bit about me. My name is Flavio. I am originally from Portugal, but have been living in the UK for the last 8 years. I'm a certified data analyst and I work for a company called Logical, where I'm a managing consultant and also a Power BI developer. So I'd like to run you through 5 main data visualization techniques inside Power BI. But before we start, we're going to touch on a few principles. I want to spend just a few minutes on that to make sure we have the foundations covered and to make sure that these techniques actually work to our benefit and not the other way around. And the point I wanted to make with these principles is that these techniques should not be your go-to by default. So what I mean by that is the native visuals in Power BI will already give you a lot of power. And if you use those well, you're going to get a lot out of your reports. So I would recommend you use that as your first port of call. And then if that doesn't do what you need, then you can move on to these techniques to enhance your reports. So on these principles, I would start with something I follow every time I start a new report, which is to understand what are we going to build. So there's no point starting and opening Power BI and starting to play with it until we know what needs to be built. This is an example of a requirements gathering template I personally use, and I'm leaving the link here in case you want to follow it. But whether you follow this or something else, the point is please have something, a structured template that you follow with a set of questions that will tell you what things you should be looking for, what KPIs are we tracking, who are the stakeholders we need to engage with, what are the features we're going to develop and also not develop, which sometimes it's even more important, saying we're not going to be touching on that. So I like to have all of that written down. So this will, there's a link there on the bottom right. Ben, will the slides be available for people? Yeah, perfect, perfect. So the slides will become available. So you'll have this link and all the other stuff I'm going to share available to you then. And after we've gathered requirements, the second thing is to do a little sketch. It's such a simple thing. It doesn't take a lot of time. You don't even need to go as fancy as that on the screen, but you should have clear in your mind what's the layout we're going to go for. It should already start to suit the requirements you've captured ahead of time. You should have a think of the color palette you're going for. How are the menus going to look like, the icons? So if you start a project without knowing none of these things, I think the end result is going to suffer. So it would be a good idea to get the requirements and then do a little sketch of what you think the end result should be. I think that's really important. Then number 3, I'm calling out something here called sticking to the basics, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. I'm just going to point you to a PDF by Microsoft, Zero to Beautiful Data Visualization Best Practices. It's very basic. There's nothing in here we haven't heard already. But if you follow these basics, I think your product will be a lot stronger. So I'm talking about things like embrace clarity. What do they mean by that? Don't do the example on the left, do what's on the right. I haven't seen people do 3D stuff like that in a long time, so I think we're safe there. But in any case, you want to make sure you have titles, you have labels, that your color have enough contrasts. Again, these are basic things that will go a long way to make a product a lot better. Other things like being consistent. Here they're referring to colors, for example. Make sure the colors are consistent throughout the page and throughout the report. Again, something that isn't difficult to do. And there's a few more rules like supporting readability, achieving balance, like don't bunch up your graphs together. So I won't go into detail in any of this, but I will just highlight this aspect right here, which is around accessibility, and this sometimes gets forgotten. So you need to consider people with low vision or color blindness, for example. The report should be available and readable for those people as well. So there's a resource pointing here, a very useful tool, an online checker basically, that if you type in a foreground color and a background color, and you can see here a preview in this box at the bottom, this will tell you how much the contrast ratio is. So that number there will tell you how much contrast you have. So if you have black foreground and white background, the contrast is 21. That's as good as it gets. And if you start to change that, then there's some checks, automated checks, that will either pass or fail. So the point is that you could run your proposed color scheme through a tool like this, and then you'll realize, right, I need to change my decisions to make it easier for other people to understand what I'm trying to do. So very useful tool that will be available on the resources for you as well. Okay, number 4, we've talked about accessibility. And number 5, the final tool I'll leave with you for now is this very useful Power BI report that basically shows you all the types of charts that you have available to tell a specific story. So if I'm something locking me out here, refresh the page. So let's say you want, for example, to represent a correlation of some sort. There's a menu here that will show you types of visuals that will allow you to tell that story. So bear with me a second. So if I go on to correlation, these are things that you could use. You could use scatter plots and you could use heat maps. This is perhaps not such a good example, but if I go to distribution, you could use histograms and box plots and violin plots, and you can start getting very creative and exotic. And if you want to go to ranking, another example, you have your trusty bar and column charts, lollipop charts. The point of this is you have a story to tell, and this is a tool that will enable you to figure out what's the visual that will best tell that story. So something very useful that I'll leave with you as well. All right, and if we just put all of this together, I'll just spend another couple of minutes showing you a little case study. And I'm bringing up a website called Perceptual Edge, and this is run by a gentleman called Stephen Few. And if you are in the data analytics world, you might have come across his name. He has a very useful book called Show Me the Numbers. But what Stephen does here is he breaks apart visualizations and explains what's good and what's bad about them. For example, this tree map right here was shown on the Guardian newspaper a few years back. And it's trying to compare the UK budget deficit, which is this black box, against other amounts like bailout money and NHS spend, so we have a sense of scale. And Steve has a very interesting analysis here where he basically says that this chart actually does not convey what it's supposed to convey easily. And he points out a few reasons. For example, if you didn't have the numbers, you could not say how much is the NHS spends relative, for example, to mortgage lending in 2007. Because even though, actually, I'll tell you that the number is exactly the same, you put it in different sized squares or rectangles. So that's almost impossible to say, and that's not the point of the chart ultimately. So if we scroll down a little bit, it proposes an alternative to that visual. And lo and behold, a little bar chart comes to save the day. It's one of those almost foolproof visualizations. And what is done is that is put the budget deficits as this vertical black line. And now you can achieve the task that we're supposed to achieve, which is to compare that against all the other amounts, which by the way are sorted. So that's a lot easier now to understand as opposed to this tree map. So that's just an example. And there's other case studies here in this website, quite useful. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say on these principles. So now let's move on to the techniques I wanted to bring to you today. The first one, Python and R scripts. I won't spend a huge amount of time on this because these have been around for quite a while. But for completeness, I'll just show you the sort of thing you can do with this. So if you do want to use a script, I'm going to demonstrate Python today. If you want to use one of these scripts, you would need to follow the installation guides by Microsoft, which I also leave here. And I'm going to be using the Seaborn package, which is one of the many packages you have available in languages like Python. So I've already went ahead and brought that in to my Power BI. And what I want to do now is grab a code I've written previously, and I just want to demonstrate the sort of thing you can achieve with Python visuals. That will think for a little bit. And what you should hopefully see in a second is a chart you cannot create with Power BI natively. So this I would describe it as a mix between a scatter chart in the middle and a histogram in the edges. I would say it would suit the purpose, for example, statistics or data statistics. That would be the most common use for this. If I come here to the properties on the chart and I change the color, you'll start to see how I can affect that visual. So I'm gonna change the color to red. And just like that, you start to see I'm influencing that behavior. And if I go here to the Seaborn package documentation, I won't obviously go through it. I'll just highlight some of the things you can do. So if I change the kind of chart I'm representing from hex to histogram and I run that again, you should hopefully see the end result changing a little bit. So the point I'm trying to make here is you can customize this to suit any of your needs. You could change the backgrounds, change the axes. So very, very flexible. And hopefully you've seen a little bit of what we can do. I won't spend a lot more time on this, but just be aware if you need to use this, there's limitations, like the number of rows you can display, the licensing, you need some paid licensing to be able to run this, and you won't be able to publish to the web. So external facing websites or publishing will not work in this case. Of course. So there's a question here all about the licensing. Is it to run the Seaborn package? And the answer is just to run any Python visual. So it doesn't really matter what the package is you're running. I just showed an example with Seaborn. If you choose pandas or anything else, NumPy, you still need the licensing for the visual, not for the package. So it's R or Python visual as a whole that needs a licensing. Oh, no. So I mean Power BI licensing. Yes, yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's it. That's it. Okay. So yeah, this licensing here is paid Power BI licensing, that should say. Okay, now we're going to move on to something that I personally quite enjoy, and it's SVG. Has anyone here heard of SVG before, or HTML? 1, 2, 3. All right, so again, this should be new to you. And let me show you an example of what this is. So SVG stands for Scalable Vector Graphics, and that's a fancy way of saying that if you draw something with SVG, that drawing never loses resolution. You can zoom in and out as much as you want, and it's always pixel perfect. So as an example, what you're seeing on this website, I would risk most of this is SVG, those icons, for example, this little drawing here. So SVG is all around the web content you see every day, pretty much. So if we have a look at what that actually means. So I have here an online editor, and here on the left, I'm defining what my drawing should be, and on the right, I'm actually rendering that. So if I change the stroke to, let's say, black, and I change the fill to red, and I run that, now you see that that circle is starting to change. I'm starting to change the properties of that circle. So what can you do, or how do you bring that, first of all, into Power BI? So if you want to bring SVG elements into Power BI, you just need two things. Number one, you need a visual capable of rendering that SVG, and I like using this one here, HTML content, which you can get by going to get more visuals from the software shop, basically. That's a free visual. And the second thing that you would need is a simple measure. So I literally copy and pasted that code we just seen onto a measure. And to prove to you it still works, if I change the stroke now to say blue, and if I change the fill to black and I run this measure, what you should see is that circle changing colors again. So I'm proving to you that I've brought this in. But now you're wondering, that's all well and good, but what can I do with a little circle in Power BI? So let's move to something a little bit more interesting with a few examples. So this first report right here, which again, I think my connection needs to reload again. This actually might ring a bell, Ben, because this one was built for the competition you ran a few months ago for this very group here. So this report uses fantasy data from the Premier League, and it's just trying to show the performance of each player in the Premier League for the data available at the time. And the SVG element is this radar chart here in the middle. Again, because I could not find a native visual that did what I wanted, then I moved on to this solution. And if I change to a different player, what you would see is that the chart gets redrawn and every vertex basically represents the performance of that player in a specific area. So it's fully dynamic. The other thing that's an SVG is this element here that shows where the player plays in a pitch. And I can show you the report very quickly. If you're not familiar with fantasy football, there's some prompts that will tell you what things mean. I could look at cost of players with time. And if I come here to player stats, again, I was trying to do something a bit different. Instead of representing data in tables, you can see the assists and the goal scored and the saves if it's a goalkeeper. And if I move here to league overview, we're representing value. And the value is simply how well does a player do for the least amount of money spent. That's what they define as being valuable. And at the time, it was this guy right here. We could actually interact with the scatter charts by using this filter. And if I wanted to look at all the stats for all the players, I had a table representing all of them. And this, by the way, is a native visual, which proves that with a bit of creativity, you can make them look quite interesting. Don't need to go all fancy. And this is just an out-of-the-box table inside Power BI. Okay, another example. I wanted to show you something I've created very recently, a few weeks back. The SVG element here is on this ticket element. So if I zoom in, I can go as much as I want, and that's always going to be perfect. It's never going to lose resolution because again, it's an SVG element. This report here is quite interesting because it uses actual data, the same data you see in train stations. If you take a train, this is exactly the same data, which is available through APIs. We were just talking about that a second ago. So if I just show you what this does very quickly, if I go from London Euston to Glasgow Central, I basically want to know, will my train be late? And I'm looking at historical data to predict in the future, what's the likelihood that I'll be on time to my destination. So if I go here to train times, so leaving Euston at 7:09 to arrive at Glasgow, there's a 67% chance I'll make it on time based on historical data. And if I keep going through this little screen, I'll see all the other times. So I do not want to take that train, 6:30. It's never arrived on time. It's probably not going to happen now. This screen right here is built with, oh, you probably struggling to see that, but there's supposed to be a timetable there with a percentage at the end. This is done with a different technique. We don't have time to go through today, but again, also uses native visuals. And the final thing that I'll show you on SVG elements, which I'll refresh again, is a report we've done for a nuclear client in the nuclear sector, and it's been all anonymized. And what we were trying to do was represent the results of surveys they were conducting in a business. And they had 5 areas on the left and then the questions to the right for that area. So for example, if I click on culture, these are all the 8 questions they were trying to track. And the light color is the first survey response and the black color is the second. So they could track the evolution of those responses. And if I look at process, then we have all the questions underneath that. So the SVG element on this page here comes on the left-hand side. So these bars, we wanted to go for that particular shape and for some gradients and also to add the icons, which would be very difficult to do otherwise. So we've used SVG to achieve this. And on the right, we have a simple out-of-the-box bar chart. So this would be a hybrid between the two approaches, which tends to work quite well. Just as an example, if I go there and change the business units, which you could think of it as a department inside a company, that will be all dynamic and filter for that specific department. So let me just move on here to Power BI Desktop now to show you the behind the scenes of that same report I've just shown you. So a couple of things I will highlight is, as we know, we do this with DAX. We would do measures to achieve that result. I've tried to make everything as dynamic as possible. For example, on the settings, we have a measure for bar height. So if I change that from 80 to 70 pixels and reload, you should see all the bars shrinking a little bit, which they've just done. So all those bars, I just look into that measure to know how high they should be effectively. And the second thing I will show you is how one of those bars is actually drawn, and that's the DAX code behind it. Now, this probably looks more intimidating than it really is, because we just seen the example a second ago of how to draw the circle. This is almost the same effectively. So if I go there and I change that gradient to be red, you'll start to see the effect that has. See, I'm starting to change the gradient of that bar right there. Then the only thing I'm doing is applying a bit of gradients, nothing very complicated. But the heart of it, it's these 5 or 6 lines right here, because these are the vertices of each point on the bar. So if I change that to 75 pixels, you'll see the effect that has. And I'm starting to change the shape of that bar. I can make it round if I wanted, or I can make it anything that you can basically come up with, you can draw it here. And the main point is, if I now select a different business unit, you can see that new shape moves with the data. That's effectively the point, because it's fully dynamic and attached to the data source. So that just goes to show what you can achieve. Yes, there's a question. So the question is, if I have a filter for the business units. Oh, I see. The way I've done the measures, I always need a filter on the business units. So as if you can see the little icon, there's a round one, meaning I'm forcing a selection to happen. Because if I take it out, then the data would just explode. It just wouldn't make sense. This would be what data model you've set up here behind the scenes, and how do you represent that data. So in my case, I forced this page to always have a business unit selected. So if I don't have that, I just want to render the page. No. So to be clear, the business units are just more rows in my table, effectively. And what you're seeing on the left-hand side of the screen are the 5 questions, the 5 areas they wanted to track. So basically, you can imagine behind this, I can show you. Oh, I see what you're saying. I haven't tested that actually, because we knew we needed the 5 on the screen at all times. That's a good question, actually. I think it would not do that, because I forced the bars to be an X amount of pixels minimum, so it would never go to 0. That's actually a good question. So yeah, that was very bespoke to fit this scenario right here. Yeah. Okay, thank you for that. Right, that's our SVG elements. We've gone through this. Oh, and this one I haven't shown you. So this right here is some work I've done for an Italian startup a couple of years ago. And they basically apply machine learning to football data. So they process huge amounts of data for each football game. And then their algorithm will basically give each player a score when they play against an opponent and a specific formation. And it will predict in the future against opponents the team hasn't played with yet, how well will those players do. So it's pretty clever stuff. And my task was to represent that on a front end, which is what I've done here, that you can see on the screen. So if I go through the different formations and I click them, they will be drawn on the pitch. So you can see those are changing. And the SVG elements are the players' pictures and the name and the label with the score. So again, you'll be hard pressed to find a native visual that could achieve these results. So that's why I went for this SVG choice. So that was quite interesting to come up with. So again, a question, did I place the bets? That's the last bit we haven't done. Yeah. That's true. Yeah, so we're just saying there's a whole host of BI enthusiasts applying BI to football, which is very true. Okay, and now we've gone through this one as well, and this one too. Right, so that's SVG, and now we're going to move on to something I've just started recently to work with, and it's actually quite exciting, and I think you'll find the same, which is DNAB. And before I tell you what DNAB is, I'll tell you what it's based on. And DNAB is based on this language called Vega and Vega-Lite, and they call themselves a visualization grammar. Much like the SVG we've just seen, you have code that translates into visuals, and this is the same thing, perhaps with more advanced capabilities, I would say. So I will show you what Vega can do for you. So we have the same scenario. On the left, we have the code. On the right, we have the visual it generates. This is an online editor from this Vega tool. There's only a few major building blocks to build something with Vega. So right here, you have your data. So if I change that value to be, say, 50, and I run that again, you should start to see that bar changing value. If I change that to be 100, so you're starting to see how that data comes about. Then there's a new, there's the next part of it is this signals bit, and you can think of it as dynamic variables pretty much. So what's being done here is that this chart is listening for mouse moving over the chart and then doing something. So if I hover, you'll see that the color changes. That's effectively the behavior that this is controlling. So there's some signals that allow you to interact and do some interaction with the visual. Then there's an aspect here of scales and axes. And this simply means what is my x-axis and the y-axis. What data goes in there? How do I format that? That's all controlled by this section here. And finally, if I oversimplify things a little bit, we have the marks, which is actually what's going to get drawn, in this case, rectangles. So that's an oversimplification. But if I change that, you'll start to see how I affect the visual. I can change the color to red, and the highlights I can do black. So if I hover, you're starting to see I'm changing what you're seeing on the screen. Okay, and I've shown it the one-to-one. Now, where is this better than the normal bar chart you have in Power BI? So let's see a little example of that inside Power BI. So if you want to represent these visuals, you'll need the DNAB custom visual. That's what allows you to plot Vega visuals. And here I have to really give a shout out to Daniel Marsh-Patrick, because he's the author of this plugin effectively, and he has a very useful website with examples and with all the documentation. So hats off to Daniel. He's really done an outstanding job for the community here. And if I go onto the settings of this visual, I'll be able to show you how we can interact with it. Again, you have the same code that just described on the online editor. Same thing works here. But now this is where the advanced functionality will come in. So let's say I want my bars to be rounded instead of square like they are. There's an option here that I can change. And if I render that again, come back, starting to see I have a bit of a radius that I couldn't do in a normal chart before. What other things can I do? I'm just going to grab some code I've done already. Let's say I want to add a pattern to fill the bar instead of that gray. So all I had to do that would be to come here to the specs and change my mark to be this thing I just copied. And that will, just like that, change the pattern. There's a background color and a foreground color. So if I again change those, you'll start to see how you can affect that fill. If I come here to the website one to show you, that's what I was telling you about the website from that hosts this visual. There's a number of patterns that have already been done for us. So if I choose, for example, circles 560, and I come back and I do circles 550, I get rid of the rest. Done that right. That should now plot a different pattern that is just available to me. I think this is a very bad design choice, just to be clear, so don't use that. I just want to demonstrate the sort of thing you can do. There's more available here, and you can even create your own and then host them and bring them into this visual as easily. So very, very powerful stuff. Now, you might be wondering how interactive this stuff is, and if I hover over the bars, nothing is really happening, which is not the default behavior you would expect from a Power BI visual. So the point I want to make now is that with a little bit more work behind the scenes, you can achieve the same exact result. So now on this other tab, I have a chart that has a tooltip. If I click this, it will cross filter, it will cross highlight. So this is now the default behavior you're used to in Power BI. And without going into a lot of the detail, you can see here we have to do a little bit more work. You basically work with layers. So there's two sets of bars, one underneath the other. And if I click one, then that exposes the bars behind it, and I can change the opacity, for example, if I want. And I replay that, and that changes the opacity. So you're working with layers on top of layers, and you will achieve exactly the same results. So pretty powerful stuff. Right, but these are minor cosmetic tweaks. So let's move on to something that could be a little bit more interesting. So if I move on to this example, and I'm coming back to the browser again. So this is an example where we're showing, this is a bit big, make that smaller. We're showing a globe, and I'm plotting earthquakes all over the world in that globe. And if I interact with it, I can make the earthquakes bigger and smaller, and I can even rotate the globe east and west, north and south. Here on the left, that's the code has already been done for us. So if I grab all of that and try to put it in Power BI, let's try to do that. Spoiler alert, it's not going to work. And we're going to explain why that's not going to work. So I'm going to put my code in the visual, and it does draw the sphere, but not everything else. So sorry about that. It's gone away. And the reason why that's not going to plot the same result if we investigate is because the visual is using a relative URL. So it's pointing to something on that website that I do not have access to, so it's not going to render. So a little trick that actually might come handy in different situations is if you hit F12, I'm using Chrome, and that will launch the developer tools, but other browsers have this available as well. So if I launch that and hit F5 to reload the page, you're going to see all the artifacts or scripts that are loaded into that page. And what I'm actually interested on is this JSON right here with the countries. And if I come back, I'm also interested in my earthquakes data, which I'm also going to load. So what I've done is I've just basically fetched the live URLs, and this is exactly what I need for my visual. So if I grab that and put it in Power BI instead there, well, now we're going somewhere. That's already drawn the countries. That's good. And if I do the same for my earthquakes and I replace the URL, now I get exactly the same result inside Power BI. So that's quite interactive, and I can still rotate as I was doing before. Now, if you notice, I'm just using a static URL, so that's never going to change, even if there's new earthquakes. But I've done some investigation, and this actually comes from the US Geological Society. And upon further investigation, they actually have some interesting data feeds that shows you earthquakes live for the last day or for the last week or for the last 30 days. So it's very easy just to come here and get all earthquakes for the last week live. So if new events happen, this will get updated. And if I use this link instead of the static one, and I bring that here instead, this right here are live earthquakes that just happened in the last week, and we're getting live data here. So if I rotate a little bit, so I can actually see there's been a earthquake in my hometown. I live there in the Azores. That's where I come from. So I can see there's something happening there. So now we have the fully interactive visual inside Power BI. If I just exit that, you can see that's what you would expect. Now, but you just seen me dragging this left and right, and it's interactive, but what about using the mouse to zoom in and out as you are used to? So if you want to do that sort of thing, you can definitely do it. And if you come here to the library, which I'll show you in a bit more detail in a second, there's here a zoomable map. And this is the library of examples that use the Vega visuals. And if I move this, now this is interactive. And what's responsible for this interactivity is this section here with signals, what we talked about a second ago with dynamic variables. So I've already went ahead and I've copied that code onto Power BI. And what you should achieve is a fully interactive. So I'm interacting with my mouse and I can go left and right. So we just made this chart a little bit better with no need for those scrolling bars we had a second ago. So that's an improvement. And the point I'm trying to make here is that you can customize these visuals as much as you want and achieve pretty much any behavior you want. And the final thing I'll show you to drive that point home is yet another map. But the point being that you can even let the end user select things like colors. And this isn't restricted to maps, it could be anything. And you could change, for example, what the grid looks like, which you're probably struggling to see there. Change that. Or you could even change the width of the countries, thicker or thinner. And if I hover over the countries, you can see the highlights. And I can change what that color is. I could bring up a tooltip. I could show the country name. It's just an endless array of possibilities you have here with these DNAB visuals. And that's why I'm actually quite excited to start working with this stuff. Okay, the final thing I will show you on DNAB, or actually Vega, is the library of examples. So here at the top, you have your usual bar and column charts. But if I scroll down, there's some interesting stuff. Like, for example, these, oh, looks like we've lost the screen. It's back. This represents all the airports in the US. And if I hover over those, it will show me all the connections coming out of that airport. I can think of a practical use case, but as a test, it's quite interesting to see the sort of behavior you can get in here. Other things you could do that I find quite interesting is, for example, this calendar view. And this is representing stock market changes on a map, on a calendar every day and every month. So that could be quite useful to represent changes over time, and it's a different way to convey that information. And the final thing I'll show you is just to show you how much you can do. Someone has even went to the trouble of coding Pacman, and this does work. Please don't add Pacman to your reports, but you could do this kind of thing if you had the patience to code it. Well, and someone is saying people might actually use the reports if you have a Pacman game in there, which is very true. All right, that's DNAB. How long do I have, Ben? No. All right. Yeah. All right. Yeah. Yeah. I'm basically. Yeah. I'm gonna wrap up. So everyone. Cool. Everyone can go home in time. I'll just run through this very quickly. I won't even do the example I had in mind. But this tool here, Microsoft Articulator, is a result of a Microsoft research project. I'll just show you the library of the stuff you can do. They have a gallery here. It's very much like the one we just seen. This one looks to me a bit more artistic, if I can say, but you could achieve the same results we've achieved with this tool as well. So you have an interesting bump chart there, and they would explain how to build that. If you want to show ranking and changes over time at the same time, that's quite a useful visual. I'm not a big fan of stuff like this, if I can be honest, because it's visually interesting, but it's very hard to interpret. So that's my reasoning behind that. It's like a circular, stunky chart almost. So right, there's a whole range of stuff you can get from there. We don't have time to go into that, unfortunately. And really, to close out, if after everything you've just seen, there's still something you got to do that you cannot achieve, which that would be hard to find, but it could happen. Then your last option is to go to the Power BI SDK, the software development toolkit. And that's basically the same approach that people who develop apps for the software store would use to code any apps. Just a warning, it does require some hardcore coding and programming, so it's not as easy as the stuff we just seen right now, but it's definitely an option there. Right, and 10 minutes over time, that is me. Any questions? So the question is, how many of this stuff is supported on Power BI service? So I would say it's all of them, apart from the implications I've told you on Python and R that you cannot publish to the web. But everything I've shown you, actually, if you look at the examples there, the SVG, easy, the DNAB, actually on the website, if you go there, there's some examples throughout this website that use DNAB and they just publish fine. And then the Articulator actually is the one I haven't tested, but I'm pretty convinced that will work as well. Yeah, yeah. So I'm getting confirmation that will work as well. So you should be good to publish as well. All right, more questions?